The fog arrived as it always did at the edge of night, not as weather but as a slow unveiling of things the day had refused to hold. It took shape along roof lines and well stones, slipped over fences, and pressed itself against windows with the patience of an old memory. In the village of Vandorf, where mountains tightened the horizon and wind carried the faint taste of iron, the Bon was the keeper of an inventory no ledger would claim. Names, footsteps, tattered routines. A bell that insisted on being heard long after its tower had been sealed. Through it, the past returned without knocking. And beneath it, people were forgotten in a way that was heavier than death and lighter than breath. Those who counted such things said that disappearances clustered on nights when frost silvered the fields before midnight. Those who did not count preferred to close shutters, push latches into place, and let silence shoulder the mystery. The truth, if it existed, did not start with thunder or spectacle. It began with a woman arriving alone, and with the sound a car makes when it finally decides to stop. Elena had grown up in a city far enough from mountains that the sky behaved like a promise rather than a lid. She was a journalist not because she loved headlines, but because she could not tolerate blank spaces. Her grandmother had vanished in Vandorf 4 decades earlier, on a night described by the family in small, inconsistent fragments that never aligned. The disappearance had become a private climate in Elena's life, cooling birthdays, swallowing holidays, settling over the table when voices went quiet. What could not be explained was smoothed over by routine, but the absence remained, precise as a scar. Her arrival at Vandorf unspooled without drama. She parked near a trough where horses no longer drank and stood for a moment simply to listen. The village had a way of refusing first impressions. It presented gray slate roofs and old timber, walls patched with lime one season and stained by smoke the next. It offered the smell of damp wool, old bread, and the mineral breath of the mountains. Elena carried a hard-sided case, a stack of notebooks, and the sense, unwelcome but familiar, that she was late to something that had already happened. She found a room in a low building where the corridor light faltered and the floor complained in certain spots. She placed her recorder on the sill and watched the damp gather on the glass. She told herself she would work methodically, but as always, the work began inside her, with the small violence of recognizing a place her grandmother had last named. On her first night, the bell rang, one note, then a pause long enough to measure by heartbeat, then another as if the valley itself were counting. The tower had been sealed years ago after a storm cracked its inner beams and set the village to arguing about restoration they could not afford. The bell's voice carried nonetheless, worn smooth by use long before Elena was born. It moved through streets as a low tide moves through a channel, even, patient, pulling. Elena felt the sound before she followed it. She stepped into a lane where moss thickened in the cobble joints, turned once past a bakehouse gone to storage, and emerged before the church. The tower stood with its boarded windows and a faint lean to the north. She stood long enough for her pupils to widen and bring the dark into a softer focus. The fog made the tower taller. It made everything taller. Somewhere nearby, water moved under stone. Somewhere farther, a gate clicked in a breeze. The bell gave a third note. The night held the shape of an answer and then refused it. Back in her room, she wrote that the bell was less a sound than a way for time to report itself. She added that the fog treated boundaries not as rules but as suggestions. She allowed herself a line she did not intend to publish. The village felt as if it had rehearsed forgetting until the performance became habit. She slept in short segments and woke with the ordinary relief that morning brings even to those who do not seek comfort from it. In daylight, Vandorf was matter of fact. Fields wore their geometry with practicality, strips of rye and potatoes stitched by hedges and dry stone walls. Chickens obeyed the ancient itinerary of chickens. Hooves left familiar crescents in mud where roads widened. The mountains framed everything but did not apologize. Elena let the day teach her the names of shades, pewter over the path, slate against the stream bed, the green of pine where frost pulled back only grudgingly. She began with the Civic Archive, which occupied one room of the municipal building and borrowed space from another. The paper there had acquired the soft weight of things that have attended too many winters, handwriting condensed and expanded through decades. Entries approached competence and then drifted toward haste. There were births, deaths, marriages, land transfers, fines for what had once been called disturbances, and a consistent effort to record the ordinary as if it might keep calamity away. The archive said little about the fog. It said less about disappearances. It did not say her grandmother's name at all. What it offered instead was a run of years in the late 19th century when expenditures spiked for timber and lime, and a series of payments described as offerings to the monastery at the forest's edge. After that, an abrupt stop, then a season of repairs to farm roofs, a line item for a new cistern, and a single notation about a fire that damaged the eastern quarter. No details given, as if fire needed none. Elena walked the eastern lanes and measured buildings with her eyes. Repair lines showed in stucco. Beams were newer above older stones. She recognized the vocabulary of reconstruction. The way A joined tells the story of the break-it bridges. She traced a loop that led inevitably to the square, and the church, and the tower that was at once landmark and warning. She made notes and then crossed them out when her conclusion felt too convenient. She tried to be honest and found that honesty, too, could be a fog. Days took on a rhythm that felt ritualistic, because ritual is what people make when answers will not hold. Elena rose before the street, cleaned itself of the night, and walked the perimeter footpaths. She collected details the way certain birds collect metal: a window propped with a spoon, algae the color of old coins, a fence repaired with mismatched planks whose original paint formed a gradient of time. She noted expressions learned by a community over generations: the polite refusal, not unkind, the nod that grants permission to pass without inviting questions. She wrote that people here protected each other from recollection by providing an exact amount of information and no more. The fog rehearsed itself each evening. It took its time, gathered itself along the stream, and negotiated with the cold as it climbed the slope. On some nights, it was only residue, a suggestion of milk in the air. On others, it was total, a tactful erasure, especially kind to edges. The bell did not ring every night. It rang when the village felt thinner. Elena resisted pattern and then surrendered to it, because pattern is the language a place uses when it cannot afford narrative. A path led her to the forest. Vanishes. The trees there were older than the village and had outlasted storms that would have named themselves, had naming been allowed. The forest kept its floor neat and its canopy argumentative. Elena found the ruins as others had: blackened stones, a scatter of char, a corner of a wall that had remembered how not to fall. The monastery had been small and practical. The pond beyond it caught fog as a shawl catches scent. She noted that the fire had been thorough but considerate. It had gotten its work done in a night and left the trees alone. Stones thoroughly scorched on one face and clean on another declared what wind had been present and what had not. A fire that chooses only one building is not the work of lightning. It is the work of decision. Elena returned with a trowel, not in the spirit of excavation, but in the hope of invitation. Soil tells stories differently than paper. It is precise without being declarative. She lifted the top layer and found charcoal in pockets the size of spoons. She found small nails and a fragment of glass melted into a bead. She found a buckle that had given itself to rust. She resisted turning these into sentences. Objects deserve context before they are forced to confess. The edge of the crypt presented itself as a collapse rather than a door. Beneath a plate of stone dislodged by frost and roots was a cavity cool enough to make breath visible even at noon. Elena widened it carefully and allowed her eyes to learn the interior as light permitted. There were bones in the sober arrangement death demands when it happens in company. There were fewer skulls than bodies suggested. There was the emptiness of a plate where something had once been mounted. She thought of the bell before she allowed herself to admit that she had thought of it. The heart of a bell is not an organ, merely a clapper at the center, but the word had its own efficiency, and folklore uses language because it understands what it can persuade people to protect. Elena wrote that the village had installed a silence with the meticulousness of those who expect to be judged by what they fail to say. The inn held fewer guests than a building requires to remain calm. In the room Elena had taken, drawers remembered other hands. She found a narrow box at the back of the wardrobe, affronted by dust. It held a ribbon turned colorless by years and a folded cloth stubbornly neat. Inside lay a book hand-stitched in a style too careful to be dismissed as hobby. It belonged to her grandmother. The pages kept their shape because the paper had been chosen by someone who understood that some words deserve the dignity of survival. Elena read without reading aloud. The book had not been written as a confession. It was an account of days and their contents. Weather, visits, a child's fever, the cost of salt, a repair to a fence. Only at intervals did the language permit itself a temperature. The fog entered the record as one might note a neighbor, familiar, present, both helpful and inconvenient. The bell received respect the way one greets a magistrate, even when one disapproves of the law. The entries approached a night that had divided the village's life into before and after. Her grandmother had been young then, or at least younger, and the lines held the steadiness of someone who had found a way to live inside a mystery without claiming knowledge of it. The last page was missing, which is the sort of drama a storywriter would not permit in her draft for fear of being accused of contrivance. Life is more bold than art. The absence made sense because it refused to. Elena rested the book on her knees and allowed the room to assemble around her. The pale of the plaster, the nail head under flaking paint, the faint throb of traffic that was not traffic but wind. She considered that her grandmother might not have left at all. The village, after all, kept things in ways the world had forgotten. A rumor becomes heritage when it survives those who could contradict it. Elena traced older maps in the municipal drawer, the ones prepared by a careful hand when maps were still both art and authority. Beyond the monastery, the land had once held a settlement, now absent from memory. A tilting fence, a place where a path ended because a door had opened there for years. An orchard that had not reappeared after the fire. She followed the lines on foot. The earth remembered the orchard even when trees did not. Bulbs emerged in spring in a pattern that declared rose. Stone that had once accepted the shape of a threshold accepted grass with less enthusiasm. She found a well she had not meant to find. It had been sealed by kindness rather than law. Stones placed so the opening would not tempt children. A cover heavy enough to keep animals safe yet removable by anyone determined to look. She did not remove it. She placed her palm on the stone and allowed the cold to move into her. She knew enough to recognize this as a site where people had learned to avert their faces. She knew enough to name what communities do when a decision has to be lived with for more than a season. She wrote that absence has weight. She wrote that Vandorf had learned to carry it with practice. The archives gave no arrests, no trials, no sermons, no proclamations. They provided, however, a season of increased births and another of sudden departures. Children were named more carefully for a time, as if names could seal a rescue. There were lists of donated textiles and a request to the diocese for funds to restore a chapel destroyed by accident. Accidents generate different handwriting. These entries were tidy. The ink had itself under control. Nights fractured into episodes. On the nights the bell rang, the fog arranged itself with intention. It arrived along the stream at the hour cattle shift their weight in sleep and reached the square when cats find new roofs to cross. It used the familiar geography of breath and narrow corridors of cold. It pressed itself into the cracks around door frames. It treated thresholds as puzzles worth solving. The bell's rhythm mattered. It counted in a way that was not arithmetic, yet felt like one. 3 notes, a pause, then 2, then 1. A code designed by those who believed in codes. Elena mapped the occurrences and found they agreed with dates that had not been recorded. Anniversaries of something that had been abolished, or perhaps rehearsals for a trial that never came. The village owned an invisible calendar. The fog was its clerk. She observed faces through glass as the bell sounded. Eyes kept down, hands stilled midway through tasks, a posture assumed not to convince outsiders, but to survive the next minute with dignity intact. The bell did not summon, it affirmed. Elena understood why people had begun to vanish. Not by magic, but by a gradual and persistent alignment with the behavior that the bell demanded. In a community rehearsing absence, some bodies obeyed too thoroughly. Guilt is not grand. It is housekeeping that never concludes. It turns every object into an inventory item and asks which of them belong to those who are not there. In Vandorf, guilt lived in shelves arranged too neatly and in the habit of patching walls with more care than painting them. It lived in the way hands moved toward curtains before remembering not to look. It lived in the willingness to forget birthdays that coincided with anniversaries of smoke. Elena allowed herself the thought that the fog was the village's efficient metaphor. When people could no longer carry images, the air did it for them. The mist erased edges because edges are where conflicts reside. It dulled sound because words trap people into remembering what they have said. It touched faces and stole the quick assurance of recognition. It made every hesitation forgivable. It created a world where the crime could be rehearsed as a ritual without naming itself. She returned to the ruins and found, not for the first time, that the blackened stones organized her thinking. Someone long ago had decided that forgetting would be kinder than confession. Someone had believed that acts can be dissolved into weather. Somebody had mistaken decay for absolution. The village then practiced the religion of silence so long that silence became geography. A storm came down the valley as if dropped by a larger hand. Rain arrived cold enough to taste of rock. The river grew ambitious, and the street drains concerned themselves with their responsibilities. The bell tower held its angle. The fog could not thicken under such rain, but it could reside in corners and cling to stone like a second skin. Water disturbed soil near the monastery and revealed a layer that would have remained modest for another decade. Elena found it after the storm left the fields heavy and the air new. The layer was a scatter of char overlaid by clean earth in a speed that could not have been natural. Someone had blanketed the evidence too efficiently. Beneath char was a crease of ash that accepted her fingers and left them the color of old newsprint. Within the ash, she found hardware that did not belong to the building. Buttons, a clasp, the spiral of a child's toy. She did not lift them further than necessary. She made a record with care and placed each back, the way one might apologize with hands. It was no longer defensible to keep the conclusion at bay. The monastery had been a shelter to people the village had decided to unsee. Say, laborers out of work after a failed season, families who arrived speaking a dialect the valley had no patience for, a community that prayed to the same God from a different corner of the room, or simply those who owed money they could not pay. The details had blurred with convenience. The act remained. A night had been chosen, the bell had been used, a fire had been lit, and the village had returned to its beds the way a body returns to a chair after a long day. Elena sat at the edge of the site until dusk found her. The fog tested the grass and agreed to stay. She understood that the disappearances were a continuation without theatrics. Those who did not fit the story the village told itself were led to the edges until the edges learned to swallow. Some left in the night because leaving was safer. Some remained on paper but not in houses. Some were rearranged into myth. The bell rehearsed this and the fog provided a curtain. Together they made forgetting a civic art. The morning after the storm felt theatrical, only because habit had trained the village to avoid scenes. The air cleared where it needed to and kept its milk where it wanted privacy. Roofs steamed gently in the sun. A shepherd recalculated his route. The church kept quiet because a bell does not argue with weather. The ruins held their place in the forest, which is the most honorable task a ruin can accept. Elena sent files to those who would know what to do with them. She documented the site and labeled her work with more care than she had given any project before. She walked the square as if counting something more complicated than steps. She placed her grandmother's stitched book, wrapped again as she had found it, on the sill of her window as if offering it to light. She did not set conclusions to music. She did not give the story a hero. She allowed the truth the dignity of being ordinary. By afternoon, a stillness took hold that was not fear. It was the quiet of a village that had found the weight it should have been carrying and recognized it as its own. No arrests, no public penance, no ceremony. Merely a recalibration of what the place would allow itself to remember. Memory, when it is at last permitted, rearranges furniture with a competence that feels like mercy. In the days that followed, people resumed the errands that feed a week. Bread cooled on sills again. Laundry negotiated with wind on lines. Children invented new games that had not been inherited from generations who needed rules to keep from looking where fire had been. The tower continued to lean, but its body looked less combative. The bell did not ring for a while. When it finally did, the sound was smaller, as if the valley had reminded it that authority requires legitimacy. Years later, people would say that the fog had not lifted, but had changed professions. It no longer erased, it revealed. It moved differently along the stream, did less work in the square, and spent more time in the fields where the ground remembers even without witnesses. On winter mornings, it still found windows, but it offered a softer palm against the glass, as if checking a fever that had finally broken. The bell rang on anniversaries of kindness. Children learned to recognize the sound as punctuation rather than verdict. Elena left as quietly as she had arrived. The village kept her name the way it now kept all names, with care and without debating their utility. The stitched book remained where it would be safe from mice and moisture. The ruins accepted a respectful fence and a small sign that did not seek applause. The well stayed covered by stones set with a craftsman's eye. The orchard did not return, but spring placed small white flowers where trees would have been, and no one stepped on them if they could help it. Those who write grants and those who adjudicate them can call what happened a reconciliation or a reckoning, but Van Dorf knows that the words are merely labels for a simpler task. It learned to say what had been done and to keep saying it. It discovered that memory is not a court, but a weather pattern one can learn to live within. It found that acknowledging harm does not unmake a harvest, but it changes how hands reach for bread. The fog remained because places need climate, but it traded menace for instruction. For anyone listening now from a room that has never known bells or from a city confident in its lights, the lesson is not antique. Every house holds a fog of its own, the unmentioned year, the quiet refusal, the fixed smile that protects a family from an older version of itself. Silence can feel like kindness when the alternative is untidy. It breeds nevertheless. In Van Dorf, the fog came nightly because the village had fed it. It thinned when the truth finally entered the air, by way of a woman who carried notebooks the way others carry bread. There is no guarantee that every story returns with a witness, or that every archive yields a hinge that swings exactly as needed. But places respond to attention. They loosen. They stop insisting on their most defensive myths. They hum differently underfoot. The world is full of villages, called by other names, that rehearse the same rituals. The bell that should not ring, but does. The night that makes forgetting easy. The morning that arrives anyway. To live is to decide which records must survive more than one winter. The fog over Van Dorf still walks the lanes when frost suggests it. It pauses as if counting. It holds the shape of roofs whose beams have outlasted elections and repairs and births and handmade curtains. It remembers a fire because fire remembers everything. But it does not take people any longer because disappearance requires complicity. The village has decided to stay. That is the entire victory and all the miracle that is required. If the listener finds a window nearby and a night cooperative enough to offer mist, the lesson can be tested. Place a hand against the glass and consider what the air knows that the mouth will not say. Think of the wells that are better covered and the orchards that might return if hands ground themselves in contrition rather than excuses. Begin an archive where none exists. Leave room for missteps. Teach bells that their work is not command, but reminder. Give the fog permission to become merely weather. And when morning arrives, as morning insists, open the window and let the new cold in. Let it search the room the way water tests stone, persistent without hostility. If the room holds a stitched book or a map or a photograph whose edges have learned the lesson of years, do not rush it to meaning. Give objects time. Give names room. Let truth arrive as Van Dorf learned to let it, not with spectacle, not with sentences that insist on applause, but with the calm of a thing that simply refuses to leave. In this way, the village found itself again. Not clean, not restored in the museum sense, but breathable. The bell rings rarely, the fog adorns rather than commands. Children invent games in which nobody disappears. Adults count the days openly. The mountains keep their lid on the sky, and yet the sky feels less close, because guilt had been the true ceiling. The valley accepts light without arguing that it deserves it. And the ruins remain, as they should, honest, unhidden, unhealed to the extent that healing would mean lying. This is how a mystery concludes when it prefers usefulness to drama. This is how a story about vanishing reveals itself to have always been a story about staying. This is how a place learns that forgiveness is not an event administered like a holiday, but a practice with the stamina of weather. And this is how a listener, even one far away, understands that fog is not a destination for the lost, but a mirror held up to the living until they choose to see. Every silence we keep becomes climate. Every truth we face becomes air. Remember what your place has agreed not to remember, and let it breathe. If this story left you tracing your own fog along the glass, carry it forward, share it, speak it, and keep the bell for reminders, not for erasing.